Hello, Stephen. I need to get us a
Oh,
better intro than that. That is not a
well,
great intro.
we doing a flurry tip today? A
We are doing
flurry tip today?
boy tip special
Boy,
prize to those that can pronounce that correctly. Happy first week of spring.
oh, it's lovely here in North Carolina. We're having some great weather. In fact, it's going to be in the upper 70s, hitting 80 in a few days.
Well,
Yeah.
I speak Celsius. We have 14, 15, and that's
Oh, that was
glorious.
Celsius.
So,
Oh, no. Those are the Celsius numbers 10 years from now. Yeah.
okay, we don't want to go there just yet, do
Okay.
we?
No.
Speaking of which, we have a winner of our raffle from last week. Do you want to tell us who won
Right.
and what charity they picked?
So just a quick reminder, every week at the end of our tip, we do a quick quiz to basically check to see if you were paying any attention at all. And then we pick randomly from all the folks who answered the quiz. And then we give them the opportunity to pick from among three different charities, nonprofits related to working against climate change and saving species on our planet. And they get to pick the winner, and we make a $25 contribution. So the winner last week was Nicola Alexander. She can't be on today, but she picked the Sheldrick Wildlife Trust, which is a fantastic organization. If you'd like to share my screen for a second, a really fantastic organization that works to save elephants and other large mammals in Africa. And I got to tell you, you should follow them on Twitter. They post great videos of their animals and what they do for them. So really glad you picked that, Nicola, and we'll have an opportunity to pick another coming up really soon.
So about that, so at the end, like you mentioned, at the end of your tip, we are going to do a quiz. We use Kahoot like we did the last 2 weeks. So if you guys want to get ready, first of all, if you're joining us, feel free to, say hi in the comments, let us know where you're from. And your little homework is to go to Kahoot, and this is the game pin for this week. So you can go in there and
712.
Yep. And we'll put it up a few times during the show, so don't worry if you miss it, or if you, we'll remind you throughout the show. So go ahead, get ready to take the quiz at the end of the tip.
I am so ready.
You're ready?
Okay.
Yeah, you better be on the podium, Stephen.
And I think, maybe what we should also do is introduce ourselves. So I'm Stephen Feuerstein. I'm the guy who knows almost nothing but PL/SQL when it comes to software technology, but hopefully I can help you along those lines. And you are Michelle.
Michelle, I am apparently the new face of the Insum cinematic universe, and I'm just here to support you, to do the produce the show, help everyone with the Kahoot, and I'm just hanging around for the ride.
We have somebody else coming for the ride today. My dog Moonbeam, who's decided to sit on my lap for the duration with a Falcon at my feet. Usually it's the other way. He's not happy at all. All right. So should we get
yes.
This
So week 1, Stephen, you covered case expressions, case statements. Week 2, we talked about good lazy, bad lazy. By the way, we've got a page all about the Feuertips. Feel free to go there. Upcoming episodes, past episodes. Stephen, you've been great at producing a blog every week to accompany the tip. So this week, what are you going to be talking about?
I want to talk about the little voices in our heads, because that seems like totally appropriate to talk about for PL/SQL and programming, right? Or not. So here's the thing. We all have lots of voices running around in our heads. Right? I don't know how much time you think about how brains work and unconscious and conscious. It's a really complicated mess, especially because we tend to look at it from the perspective of consciousness. And that's just a tiny little part of our entire brain. And as you know, your unconscious does a whole lot of stuff for you, like keep you breathing and move your muscles around and all that sort of stuff. But it also makes a lot of decisions and does a lot of problem solving for you. And I'm sure you've all run into situations where you might be working really hard on an issue. You can't figure it out. You bang your head against the wall for hours. You go to sleep and you wake up with the answer in your head. It's not magic. Your unconscious has been working through the issues and sorting it out for you, for your conscious part. So there are little voices. I don't know about you, but as I'm writing my code, as I'm doing anything in my life, I'll have little voices sharing ideas with me. And it's all too easy for us consciousnesses to think we're really hot stuff and ignore all those voices. Now, some of those voices, if they tell you to do bad things, you should not listen to those voices. But sometimes the voices say good things. So the voice I want to talk about a little bit today is the voice that says, Stephen, Should it really be this hard? Surely there's an easier way to get to your solution. And in that context, we're going to look at an example of using string indexed collections. So why don't you go ahead and share my screen? Let's go ahead and go to SQL Developer actually for starters. Because what I want to do is start by talking about solving a problem and writing some code and then having that experience of, gosh, this seems like a lot of code. This is a utility that I built years ago called String Tracker. I've used it in a number of different environments and lots of demonstrations, so some of you may have seen it already. But the challenge I had is I needed to build a little utility that would keep track of whether or not a string had already been used. These were the names of variables. I was generating code, and I didn't want to generate local variables that have the same names because you can run into compile issues. So I wanted to keep track of the names as I was generating them. I generated L_temp, L_tempo, L_temp1. So this is the API I built to do that. It was really straightforward. First of all, because I like to use packages and APIs, I built programs to basically do the work. So mark a string is being used, is a string in use. Those are the two things we're looking at. I've got this cool little subtype to hide varchar2 32767, but we won't spend time on that now. Okay, then I need to keep a list of these strings. Now I could create a relational table, store the data in tables, commit, et cetera, but that's a lot of overhead, and I don't need it. This is not a persistent data set. It's literally, as I'm running my code, I'm generating these names and using them and then not using them anymore. So this is all going to be in memory, and therefore what I'm going to do is create a table in memory using PL SQL structures called a collection. So my list of used strings is a table of these variable names indexed by integer. So I've got a sequential list of strings. All right, to mark a string is being used, pass in the string, and I'm sorry, this is the variable based on that type. Pass in the string and add it sequentially to the list. So count starts off as 0, so the first one goes into location 1, then location 2, then location 3. Just add the strings to the list. Then I have to ask myself, well, how do I know if a string is in use or not? And given the structure that I've used here, the sequentially built out collection, the way I find out if the string is in use is I loop through my entire collection until I find a match or hit the end of the collection, and I return either true or false. Now, you always run into a situation where you want to keep demonstrations simple so people aren't overwhelmed by code, but sometimes they get so simple, it's hard to appreciate the burden of that code. So let me try to drive home that burden here. When you look at code like this, it's certainly not terribly complicated. Any of you could write this, and probably some of you have written a variation of this multiple times over the years. So it's not like rocket science, but it's still a fair amount of code to write and debug and test and maintain. In particular, this is the kind of stuff that leads to all sorts of boundary condition errors. What if I said lindex less than count instead of less than or equal to it, less than, and so on. So it's very easy for bugs to creep into little algorithms like this, even though they're pretty simple. And as I write this sort of thing, I ask myself, why am I doing this? Wouldn't it be great if PL SQL could give me a way that I could just ask, is it in the list? Do I really have to loop through it myself? This is like doing a full table scan. I don't want to do a full table scan. And the answer is yes, there are actually several different ways you can get around writing all this code. But the one I really want to talk about today is the string index collection. And I want my dog to not put her paws on my keyboard. Okay, so let's go and take another stab at the same bunch of code. So now I've got version 2 of String Tracker. All of this is exactly the same. The API hasn't changed a bit. Now things get a little bit more interesting on the back end. So notice I've got this new subtype called who cares. This is an example of what I consider to be self-documenting code. So the subtype I'm renaming Boolean to who cares. I've got a special constant called doesn't matter, and it's of type who cares. I've got a list. So here's my new collection type, and it's a table of or a list of who cares indexed by variable name.
Okay, so, Stephen, would you actually be naming your variables that way, though, in production code?
Yeah.
You would. Okay, all right. Well, I just had to ask. Who cares?
Well, I am, because I think this explicitly describes the behavior of the code. I literally don't care what's in the list. It's like an indexed organized table. All the information I'm going to need is in the index. So that's what I'm getting across here. I suppose it could be quirky. I mean, I would put a little comment here, but that's the idea. I'm literally telling you I don't care what this value is. So let's take a look. To mark a string as being used, it's pretty much the same kind of code or volume of code as before. It's a single line assignment. So what I'm going to do is take that variable name. I'm not going to put it in anywhere. I'm going to use it as the index value, the location of my list. What am I going to put in that location? It doesn't matter. It could be null, it could be true, it could be false, it could be a date. We're never going to look at it because, and here's the real magic of the string index collection, all my code, all that looping, all that checking, all my constants, all this cool stuff here, all of it just disappears. And now to see whether or not my value is in use, I just use my exist operator. I've got a method inside every collection that says, does an element exist at this location? That location could be a string or an integer when it comes to associative arrays, one of the 3 types of collections. So all the looping goes away. I have a single line of code that tells me whether or not the element exists, whether or not the string is in use. Now, so hopefully you can see that I've basically gotten rid of a lot of code I didn't need simply by changing the way I organized my data. And you can think about the exact parallel to this in your basic code, in your overall database design. If you come up with a bad database design, specifically denormalization of data, you might have a table that has all sorts of duplicate data in it, denormalized data, instead of maybe 3 different normalized tables. If you have a bad data design, then you end up writing a lot of code to compensate. So if you're writing code and you're saying, oh, should it really be this difficult? That's the time to stop, step back, revisit your assumptions, revisit your design. Now, in this case, revisiting my design, not a big deal. It's all inside my code. All I had to do really was realize that I could change that type, because all I cared about was, is it in the list? Not where is it in the list? This code basically was saying, I care about the order in which the data was added to the list. And I don't care the order in which the data was added to the list. I only care if it's in it.
So would you say that's the main differentiator, the main deciding factor in terms of when you would use one or the other, is whether you care about the order in the list?
So this is just one use case to give you the sense of how string index can help. So one idea would be that you essentially use the collection as if it were an index organized table. But there can be other advantages too. So let's give you an example of that. Let's take a look at this code. This is an alert manager package I wrote a while ago that basically will, in the piece of code that we're looking at now, and so far SQL Developer is a little bit frozen, so I think it's reconnecting to my always free autonomous transaction processing instance. Should come back up in a moment.
By the way, Colin agrees with you. Always good to ask yourself whether or not you're reinventing the wheel.
Exactly right. And,
yeah.
And if you ever, and again, the key thing is listening to that voice. If you're asking yourself, am I reinventing the wheel? Surely this is done somewhere else before. Almost certainly it is. And in the world of let me Google that for you, it's often not hard to find those other things, though of course you can't always trust what you find. Okay, so let's see. What I've got is a piece of code here in which I have 2 different groups of email addresses, and I want to merge them into a single list. Now, again, we're not talking about SQL data sets, and there's all sorts of properties in SQL to allow you to do merges, and obviously intersects, joins, etc. We're talking about in-memory data. So I've got a list of email addresses. I've got another list of email addresses, and I need to make sure that I only have one unique set. I don't want to send out any duplicate emails. So check it out. What I'm going to do is I've got a new unique recipients list. And what I'm going to do is go through all my 2 different lists of recipients. And I'm going to use the email address. So each one of these has the email address in it. I'm going to uppercase it for consistency and use that as my collection index. So what's happening here is that I can just iterate through the 2 collections. I don't have to check to see if it's already there or not. I just iterate through, define that element in my unique recipients list, use the email address, and it automatically gets rid of duplicates. It's like doing a select distinct. So I think that's kind of cool. And let's see if we have the description of the collection here. No, that's over in the package spec. So one thing to note in fact, why don't you stop sharing my screen for a sec? So I can go back to just talking to people. One thing to be wary of with string index collections is the performance impact. Now, for relatively small strings like 10 characters, 20 characters, 30 characters, as far as I can see, the performance of string indexing or integer indexing is pretty much the same. Now, what I understand to be going on behind the scenes is that your string is being hashed. There's an Oracle hash function that we can use. They may be using the same one or their own variation, but a hash function that converts the string into a hopefully unique index value, or sorry, hopefully unique integer index. So basically, there's a cost of converting or hashing that string into an integer. For relatively small strings, the cost is very small. You won't see much of a difference. But as your strings get bigger and bigger, for example, if you were using 1,000 character long strings as your index values in your array, you can definitely see some overhead and a slowing down of the work with the collection if you have that kind of string length. For the most part, you won't be having that. They might be names or addresses, and you really shouldn't see much of a performance penalty as a result of using string indexing. Any interesting comments come in? Anything we should talk about before I just keep on jabbering away?
Not at the moment, but that's a great opportunity to remind you guys, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We will address them on the show.
Cool. Let's see. So string indexing also, if you could share my screen again. Just to let you know that if you go to Live SQL, my favorite place to put all of my scripts, so you can use them whenever you want, and search on string index, you'll find a number of scripts, some that I've written, at least one that I haven't. So simple string tracker is what I just showed you. You can try it out yourself. You can grab this code and use it yourself as well. And there's also a more complex version of it, the string tracker utility, that involves both nested collections and string index collections. I don't think I'll go through all the details of this today. I'll leave it for you to look at online. We'll probably come back and talk about nested collections at a future Feuertips. But all of this is available on Live SQL for you to try out. And also, just to keep on talking, if you haven't worked with collections much in the past, there are 3 types of collections. There are associative arrays, and associative arrays have the index by clause in their type definition. There are nested tables that look very similar in their declaration. It's a table of, but there's no index by clause because in theory, there's actually no ordering to elements in a nested table. And then there's a V-array. So I could say V-array 100, and this would say you have a maximum of 100 elements in this collection. It's fairly rarely used, but you could. Now, one thing I wanted to point out here is that if you use table of, you also have the ability to say return, let's see, is my microphone is in the way. I can't see my screen. So when you're using nested tables, you could say variable name is member of, and then the list. So this is an example not of using string indexing. This is actually under the covers. It's an integer indexed array. But because of the special features of the nested table, you can take advantage of the member of syntax. Okay, well, that covers pretty much most of what I wanted to talk about with string indexing. Let's stop sharing my screen. See if anything's come up.
Yes, Angel, I think when you were talking about performance, let me turn this comment off. Here we go. That's the time the DBA says to check your code before adding index memory processor.
I'm not sure. Angel, is this?
I think it was earlier when you were talking about the size of your strings and the performance degradation, that's when your DBA is going to come.
And actually, Angel, that's a pretty good point. So if you haven't been using collections before, if you start using collections, or in general, if you change the profile of the code you're writing, you start using a lot of collections, you might start using the result cache feature. You need to understand that almost everything we do in PL SQL code has an impact on memory and also possibly other aspects of database behavior. So in general, when you start using some new feature, especially some of the newer stuff, check in with your DBAs. Let them know that you're doing this, find out if there's anything they need to change to support you properly. Certainly, when you're using collections at any point, you can consume a lot of PGA or process global area memory. So you can actually blow out the memory in your session or a user session by creating collections that are too large. I'm going to cover that when we talk about bulk collecting a future Feuer tip. But in general, with collections, you can consume a lot of PGA, and you need to be careful about that. So, for example, string tracker. If your code went crazy and started keeping track of 1 million strings, you're likely going to blow out the memory in your session. So, good to talk to your DBAs about that sort of thing, about context switching. With the result cache, it certainly involves both memory in the SGA and latching issues.
That's good advice to talk to them before, give them a heads up before things go awry and they come looking for you.
Oh yeah, they'll like you a lot better as a developer and be more likely to help you in the future if you give them heads up and work collaboratively. Yep.
There you go. So shall we switch over to, are we ready to do the quiz, Stephen?
Yeah, we don't need to use all 30 minutes if we don't have a lot of questions. Get the tip out, get back to work.
All right, here we go. So just as a reminder, you're going to kahoot.it. There's the pin there. I'm seeing between Facebook and YouTube at least 52 people watching the stream and only 13 people in the Kahoot. Come on, join.
Put in your code.
There you go. They're coming on in. Let's give it another few seconds.
And so if any of you, while we're doing the quiz and waiting for the quiz to start, if you have any other thoughts about little programming voices in your head that you think we should listen to or not listen to, feel free to chime in. We can add those to the discussion. But
I like that though. That was a great intro to the tip, because that happens all the time, right? You're writing all this code, and if you're telling yourself there must be an easier way or a better way, there probably is.
And especially because there's so many built-in packages, so much functionality, and especially if you're working in Apex, the number of Apex packages that give you all sorts of utilities like parsing out strings, generating CSVs, really powerful stuff. All right, Golrang has asked, what about collections of clobs or blobs? Well, you certainly can create collections of clobs and blobs. Depending on the size of your clobs and blobs, they will take up a lot of memory. So you want to be really careful about that kind of structure. Certainly Oracle supports it. There's no problem. You can have collections of clobs. You can have collections of objects. The object types have clobs, and so on and so forth. It just goes on and on. So you can build enormously complex structures. In fact, you can essentially take a normalized data structure in your tables and mimic them in a variety of collections, and especially nested collections and string index collections, and often really simplify the code you need to write as a result. All right. Well, that's a nice bump in numbers.
There you go. They just needed a bit of prodding.
That's right.
All right. So here we go. Everybody ready?
So it'll take a few seconds for it to load up, and then I'll read out actually all the options to you as we go through. You mark all the choices you think are correct, and then we'll go from there.
It's multiple choice, one or many. Multiple.
So when should you use a string index in your collection? It's number red.
Here's what I found.
Stop talking, Siri. When you need to work with a collection of dynamic SQL. Blue, need to find an element by a string and not a number. Yellow, quick, easy way to avoid duplicates. And green, whenever Stephen tells me to. So which of these do you think are correct? And which do you think are not correct? You have a minute left.
I'm very curious to see how they're going to mark green.
I know how they should mark green, from my perspective.
14 answers, getting there.
Let's see, I'm going to answer myself.
Oh my gosh, me too.
Looks like just about everybody has answered.
So I'm thinking the 90 seconds is a bit long for this.
Better than the 20 seconds we used on the first round, that's for sure.
People didn't even have a chance to read the question or the answers.
Now, has everybody answered as far as you can see? Or do you have more people come on?
18 answers. I believe everybody has.
Okay.
We never tested what happens if we skip, so I will make sure to do that this week before
Right.
the
Post
next
it for that.
Kahoot. Here we go. All right.
So actually, I got it wrong. I marked the first one as I marked red as correct. I got confused. So let's talk about these four choices. When should you use a string index in your collection? When you need to work with a collection in dynamic SQL? Well, I didn't even talk about dynamic SQL. That should have been a pretty good clue. But the answer is no. There's nothing specific about using collections in dynamic SQL or dynamic PL SQL that's different from doing it statically. So no, that's not a reason to do it. Need to find an element by a string and not a number? Well, that's pretty much the definition of a string indexing in a collection. Quick, easy way to avoid duplicates. That's a use case that I showed you in the talk today. My idea of merging these two different lists of email addresses simply by assigning a value to that email address over and over and over again, but you never get a duplicate. And the last one, whenever Stephen tells me to. So let's see, 5 people said that they should do that. I was not one of them, I must say. So I don't know if you're on Twitter, but you might, if you're on Twitter, you'll every once in a while see a little blow up in our little community about best practices. Should we call them best practices or proven practices, or these are good to know, but you should be careful about using them practices. But in general, I think we all conclude that you need to take anybody's advice with a grain of salt. Just because Stephen says something about PL SQL, or Tom Kite might have said something about Oracle Database, or Connor McDonald and Chris Saxon now saying something about SQL, Joel Common saying something about Apex. You shouldn't just do it because we tell you to do it. You should do it because you think highly of what we have to say, and that motivates you to go do some exploration and research. And then you conclude for yourself with your Oracle version, with your instance, with your configuration, with your application requirements, yes, this makes sense to me. So that's why the fourth one is done.
I have to say, there are many people, our comments are blowing up around this, thinking that green should have been right. Jan is disappointed. Dan thinks green should have been right. I made you turn that one into a wrong answer. So maybe, maybe that's on me. But many people think that
listen, I just think that, I also do a talk on coding therapy. And honestly, really, if you believe that I am always right and should always be followed and you should do whatever Stephen tells you to, I think maybe a little therapy is in order. I just got to say that. Okay.
Jose is still suffering from post-traumatic stress from our 20-second Kahoot. So we will not do that to you again, Jose. Thank you for trying again.
Yeah. And we have a comment from Plumman. Yes, right. What about PL SQL collections and Apex collections in terms of performance and organization? So really interesting question. So Apex collections are not something I have ever used and don't know in great detail, but I think I have the general idea. So there's an actual package called Apex Collection. So there's an API that you can use to build dynamically things that look like collections, so rows and columns, essentially a virtual table without having to have sorted it out in advance. And then there's an API within Apex itself that allows you to take that data and materialize it in reports and use it in general inside the application. Now, my understanding is that the primary use case for the Apex collections and the Apex collection API is when you want to basically have a global memory area that you can transfer data from your back-end API work, your PL SQL coding, into your front-end app without having to go directly through, for example, a query. So it allows you to basically do this dynamic construction of data. So to me, the use case for Apex collections is very different from PL SQL collections. In fact, I've been looking at some code recently in which Apex collections have been used, but not for a good reason. In other words, essentially what they've done is use Apex collections to mimic table functions. And we'll certainly do a Feuertip on table functions coming up. But the bottom line is that a table function is a function that you can select from as if it were a relational table, like select star from table, and you call the function or table, and you put in a collection. And basically the SQL engine knows how to convert a PL SQL collection into a relational table format of rows and columns. Jan points out that you can create dynamic reports with Apex collections. Absolutely. So that's fundamentally the use case. You have this very dynamic construction. You need to build it. You build it in the backend in your PL SQL code. You expose it through the API in your application. But PL SQL collections are more general useful, and certainly if you simply want to be able to say, select star from something, and something is dynamically constructed, but the number of things you're selecting is static, that's where you'd probably just want to stick with PL/SQL collections and table functions. So that would be
I
my.
have to say, I've often used Apex collections in a similar use case to the one that you described today, in terms for situations where it isn't necessarily something I need to store in the table. I just need to know what's happening with the user in that session. So maybe a cart situation, or so I've used
Right,
Apex collections in the same way.
right.
Here, Deval has a comment.
So yeah, I'm sure the Apex collection API is going to be slower than using native PL/SQL collections. That's just the nature of it. So Plowman, I'm sure they're great. It's just a matter of using them in the right place and not using them when you don't need them. If you simply need to return data as an array of data to display in a report, you do not have to use Apex collections for that. You can use a table function. It will be simpler. It will be faster. And yeah, so the performance we talked about. Yeah. Okay.
I think we've covered it all.
Any other
Great.
questions or comments? Any little voices that you want to report? You can feel free to follow up with me later, or put a comment on the post that will be published to go along with this on stringifying your indexes. There are links to documentation on collections, my different live SQL scripts, some videos on string indexing as well. So if you're new to string indexing, check out those resources, and you'll just have another tool to at your disposal for writing some
Yep.
really clean, elegant PL/SQL code.
And that post is going to be up by the end of the day. We'll also link to it in the description of the video for those of you that are watching this later. Stephen, thank you very much. Another great tip today. And
Thanks.
we will be going through all of the answers to the quiz and picking another winner
Yeah.
and getting in touch and presenting that next week.
All right. Thanks for joining us,
Oh,
everybody, and hopefully that
thanks
was.
for do all the things. Comment, like, subscribe. I would have really been angry with myself if I haven't done that.
Right. Follow us on Twitter, etc. All right.
Do all the things. Have a great week, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for joining. Bye.